Just a nurse in combat boots. That's what Dr. Sterling had whispered to Athletic Director Morrison 2 hours before the ceremony started, his eyes cutting toward the bleachers where Megan O'Brien sat alone, fingers absently tracing the worn laces of military-issue footwear that hadn't seen active duty in 20 years. They didn't know. Neither of them had any idea who was sitting 3 rows back from the premium parent seating, quietly observing exits, counting heads, maintaining the kind of situational awareness that doesn't fade just because you've traded a rifle for a stethoscope. They didn't see the faded scar tissue barely visible beneath her rolled sleeve, or the way her jaw tightened whenever the gymnasium doors opened. Dead wrong. All of it. The afternoon sun cut through the gymnasium windows at exactly 2:08 p.m., illuminating dust motes that hung in the air like suspended time. Folding chairs were arranged in 23 neat rows, facing the gymnasium stage where Principal Sterling stood conducting a final sound check with the military precision of a man who believed order was something he personally invented. His suit cost more than most teachers made in a month, charcoal gray, tailored, the kind of fabric that whispered about country club memberships and inherited wealth. A $12,000 watch caught the light every time he gestured to the audio technician. Megan sat apart from the other parents, not quite on the bleachers they'd set up, not quite anywhere that would invite conversation. Row 12, seat 4, with a clear sightline to both exits and the main doors where the senior processional would enter. Her hands rested on her knees, the left one trembling slightly, not from fear but from restraint. Muscle memory was a dangerous thing when you'd spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL combat medic before the PTSD forced you into civilian anonymity. Some mornings the tremor was worse. Most mornings, it was the boots that stopped the nightmares. The boots were everything. Worn, scuffed, the leather cracked at the heel where it met the sole, the laces frayed but still properly tied in a military bow. She'd slipped them on that morning without thinking, the way some people reached for coffee. They were the only pair she owned. The others had been destroyed in Sanjin, left behind in a collapsed building in Helmand Province where she'd pulled a kid out from under 3 tons of concrete and rebar and the kind of dust that got into your lungs for the rest of your life. That kid was now a Navy SEAL lieutenant standing in the gymnasium waiting to march across the stage. Tyler O'Brien. Her son. The one she'd never told the truth to. The gymnasium had that particular smell of adolescence and institutional cleaning, a blend of teenager cologne, floor wax, and the faint trace of desperation that only high school graduation ceremonies carried. Someone had cracked open the emergency exit in the west corner, letting in hot Denver air that mixed with the air conditioning in an uncomfortable compromise. Megan could feel the temperature shift, the way pressure changed when the doors moved. She noticed everything. The habit had kept her alive in 3 combat zones. It made civilian life uncomfortable. The bleachers had been arranged an hour ago, and already they were filling with parents in clothes that announced their net worth, designer dresses, tailored blazers, jewelry that caught light like distress signals. Megan wore scrubs under a gray cardigan that had come from a Goodwill in Aurora. Her son would graduate in the next 47 minutes. She would not be permitted to watch. Dr. Sterling noticed the boots at 3:04 p.m. She could feel the moment his eyes landed on them, that specific weight of judgment that arrives before words do. He stood at the edge of the gymnasium floor, Athletic Director Morrison beside him, both men in ceremonial dress regalia that made them look like they were conducting a military operation instead of a high school graduation. Sterling's face arranged itself into the expression of a man who'd discovered a stain on his own suit and was preparing to deduct its cost from someone else's paycheck. He was tall, early 60s, with silver hair styled to suggest that his life involved more leisure time than most people's lives contained hours. The kind of man whose voice sounded like a tank idling in a garage, low, powerful, designed to make smaller things get out of the way. He said something to Morrison. Morrison's eyes found Megan's boots. Morrison looked away. Megan was already tracking Sterling's approach before he'd fully committed to it. Her hands remained still. Her breathing stayed measured. Her posture didn't shift toward the defensive or toward deference, it simply existed, the way a trained professional exists in a room with an untrained antagonist. She'd been in rooms with Taliban commanders, with insurgent leaders, with men who decided whether she lived or died based on gestures smaller than heartbeats. A high school principal in a $5,000 suit was not going to generate a flinch. Sterling walked the distance slowly, deliberately, letting other parents notice his purpose. This was part of it, the theater, the audience, the way power works best when it's performed. A security guard trailed him, a man named Rodriguez who worked the metal detectors most mornings and who'd always been kind to Megan when she'd volunteered at the school reviewing emergency medical protocols 2 months prior. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable. Sterling looked determined. "Mrs. O'Brien," Sterling said, arriving at the bleachers with Morrison flanking his left side. His smile could have cut steel. "We have a situation." Megan turned to face him, her movements economical. Her voice, when it came, was exactly what Sterling wanted to hear, deferential, quiet, the tone of someone accustomed to being wrong. "How can I help?" "The dress code for graduation is quite specific," Sterling continued, and Rodriguez shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a man caught between the role he'd been assigned and whatever conscience he maintained beneath the security uniform. Black or navy business attire. Conservative footwear. No deviation. Sterling's eyes moved to the boots, lingered. "These appear to be military issue." "They are," Megan said. "Simple. Factual. Not defensive." "Unacceptable," Sterling said. The word hung in the air like a verdict. "I'm going to need you to remove yourself from the gymnasium and wait in a parking lot until after the ceremony concludes. We cannot have exceptions to protocol. It wouldn't be fair to the other families who followed the dress code guidelines appropriately." The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Rodriguez cleared his throat, a sound like gravel being moved. "Sir, perhaps we could." "Rodriguez," Sterling said, not looking away from Megan, "escort Mrs. O'Brien to the parking lot. Ensure she's clear of the building before the processional begins." Megan stood. Her hands didn't shake. Her face didn't flush. The tremor in her right hand quieted, or perhaps it had never been there at all, merely the tremor of restraint that looked indistinguishable from fear to untrained eyes. She'd been removed from situations before. She'd been removed by people with actual authority, people commanding actual stakes. A principal's vanity was noise. "I'll need you to come with me," Rodriguez said quietly, and there was something in his voice that suggested he knew exactly what those boots meant, or at least that he understood they meant something beyond what Sterling could see. The kind of understanding that came from working security long enough to recognize the difference between threat and strength. Megan turned to move, and that's when Tyler spotted her from the senior line, saw his mother being led out by security during the moment when he was supposed to be feeling pure joy, the culmination of 4 years of high school, the moment he was becoming something new. His face shifted from anticipation to confusion to something harder to define. Hurt, maybe. Or recognition. The expression of a child who knew that his mother was hiding something and had just received unexpected proof. She didn't turn back. Composure meant continuing to move. Composure meant not giving Sterling the satisfaction of seeing any reaction beyond acceptance. She let Rodriguez guide her toward the gymnasium doors, past the cooling unit that hummed with industrial efficiency, past the emergency exit sign that glowed green like a promise. The heat of the Denver afternoon hit her face first, then the bright weight of sun that made her eyes water, though not from what Sterling would have assumed. The parking lot stretched behind the gymnasium, rows of vehicles baking in the 94-degree heat, the asphalt still soft enough that her boot heels left small impressions that would disappear once she'd passed. Rodriguez walked her to the edge of the lot, near the tree line that bordered school property. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "those boots are magnificent." Megan nodded once. Didn't speak. Some acknowledgments live better in silence. The gymnasium doors closed behind her with the pneumatic hiss of institutional efficiency, and Megan O'Brien, Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien, the woman who'd earned 2 Bronze Stars and a Navy Cross in a career that no one at this school would ever know about, stood in a parking lot and listened to the muffled sound of her son's graduation beginning without her. The boots stayed on her feet. The boots, which were all the proof she had that she'd ever been anything other than just a nurse who didn't know how to follow dress codes. 3 weeks before graduation, Megan O'Brien sat in the school board meeting with a folder full of documentation, her voice steady and clinical as she presented the facts. The nurse's office at Denver Central High had been shuttered for 8 months despite a fully funded budget line of $47,000 remaining untouched. No medical staff. No supplies. No emergency protocols. Just locked doors and questions no one seemed interested in answering. She'd volunteered to review the emergency medical procedures after Tyler mentioned a classmate who'd collapsed during lunch with no one trained to help. The presentation took 6 minutes. Principal Dr. Sterling's response took 4 seconds. "Sweetheart, we have actual administrators for policy decisions," he'd said, his voice dropping into that particular register men use when they're performing authority for an audience. "Stick to band-aids." The athletic director, Morrison, laughed first. Then the board members followed, a ripple of permission that spread through the room like infection. Sterling leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and turned to Morrison with a smile that wasn't quite a smile. $50 says she quits within a week. Volunteers always do when they realize nobody asked them to solve anything. Megan absorbed the laughter with one measured breath. In Sanjin, she'd learned that humiliation was a weapon deployed by people who had nothing else. A man comfortable with his authority didn't need to announce it. A leader didn't need to diminish others to feel substantial. So she simply watched Dr. Sterling's face, watched the way his jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter, and understood immediately what he was hiding. Fear. Not of her competence, he didn't care enough to be threatened by that. Fear of discovery. Fear that someone asking questions about missing medical budgets might start asking other questions. Questions about where the $47,000 had actually gone. She wiped the single tear that escaped without breaking eye contact and spoke with the voice of someone who'd held dying people in her arms. A man who needs to humiliate others is usually hiding something himself. The room went dead silent. Sterling's face flushed, a deep mottled red that climbed from his collar to his hairline. He opened his mouth, closed it, then stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward with a metallic scrape. "Meeting adjourned," he said, and left the room, his footsteps too fast, too loud, the sound of someone whose composure had just fractured. A week later, Megan was in the staff lounge at Oak Creek Memorial during her lunch break, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee she'd brought from home. She'd learned long ago not to trust anything provided in institutional spaces. The coffee was still warm, still perfect, when Sterling entered with Morrison beside him, both of them laughing about something, a joke she hadn't been there to hear, which meant she'd been the subject of it. She didn't look up. She didn't acknowledge them. She simply existed in the corner, holding her coffee, being nothing more threatening than a nurse on her 30-minute break. Sterling walked past her table, and when he was directly beside her, he pivoted slightly, a movement that looked almost accidental, almost clumsy enough to be believable. His hand caught the edge of her cup. Coffee spilled across the table, across her scrubs, the liquid still hot enough to make her flinch. But she didn't cry out. She didn't jump up. She simply sat there, watching the brown liquid drip onto her white sneakers, absorbing the temperature and the humiliation in equal measure. "Watch where you're standing, sweetheart," he said, his voice pitched for the 3 other faculty members now watching. "This is a faculty lounge, not a nurse's station. Different rules for different people." Parents and teachers froze, caught between wanting to help and not wanting to be next. Sterling stood there for 3 seconds, watching her absorb the mess, then turned back to Morrison as if nothing had happened. They left the lounge together, their conversation resuming before they even reached the door. Megan sat motionless for a full minute, watching the coffee seep into the laminate. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From something else entirely, the kind of tremor that comes from holding yourself still when every cell in your body is screaming to move. Pain is data, she'd learned in the Navy. And this pain told her something she'd already suspected: Dr. Sterling was accelerating. The bed had been a test. The coffee had been a demonstration. He was establishing a pattern, creating witnesses, building a narrative. A man like Sterling needed documentation. Needed an audience. Needed the story to be about her instability, not his corruption. She stood, gathered paper towels, cleaned the table without rushing. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm enough to cut glass. Accidents reveal character, Dr. Sterling. Thank you for the demonstration. He didn't turn around. But his shoulders went rigid. His pace quickened. And Megan understood that she'd made a strategic error, not in speaking back, but in doing it well enough that the other witnesses would remember her words more clearly than his. The morning of graduation arrived grey and cold, the kind of Denver sky that threatened rain without committing to it. Megan arrived at the gymnasium at 7:15 a.m., carrying a portable medical kit she'd assembled from her own supplies at home, an AED, a CPR board, an oxygen bottle, and the equipment she'd learned to trust with her hands. The graduation coordinator, Mrs. Chen, had called her the night before. "Sarah's walking in the processional," she'd said. "My daughter. 14 years old, freshman volunteer usher. I'd feel better knowing someone trained is nearby. You understand?" Megan understood. She'd understood the moment she found the nurse's office locked, the moment she saw a budget line disappear, the moment she realized no one was trained to help if something went wrong. She was reviewing the emergency supplies in a small storage room adjacent to the gymnasium when Sterling found her. He didn't knock. He simply opened the door and threw a stack of incident reports at her feet, the pages scattering like wounded birds across the linoleum. "Pick those up," he said. "We pay nurses to clean up messes, don't we?" The papers were incident reports from the past 3 weeks, nothing significant, routine complaints about her volunteer hours, suggestions that her continued presence was making staff uncomfortable. He'd been building documentation. Building his case. Megan knelt slowly, gathering each sheet, her hand steady despite the tremor that wanted to live in them. She knew what he was doing. She'd seen it before, in military environments where power flowed upward to protection. You didn't attack someone directly if you wanted to win. You built a narrative. You created a paper trail. You made their credibility the question instead of your competence. She stood, holding the reports, her eyes meeting his with a kind of clarity that comes from having survived far worse than a high school administrator with delusions of importance. "I've cleaned up worse messes than paper, Dr. Sterling. Much worse." His face went white. Not angry, white. Because in that moment, something in her voice had shifted. Something had cracked open in her composure, just enough for him to see that this nurse wasn't just some volunteer he could intimidate. Something in the way she stood, in the precision of her voice, in the absolute certainty of her presence suggested depths he didn't understand. He left without responding. 90 minutes later, Megan stood in the bleachers wearing the boots Sterling had tried to use against her. The graduation was scheduled to begin at 10:11 a.m. The processional music was cued. Tyler was somewhere in the senior line, still unaware that his mother had been ejected from the premises before he'd even walked. A security guard approached her at 9:55, his radio crackling against his hip, his expression apologetic but resolute. "I've been asked to remind you about the dress code violation. Inappropriate footwear. I'm going to need you to vacate the gymnasium before the ceremony begins. This is not negotiable." She didn't argue. She didn't fight. She simply gathered her medical kit and stood, the boots on her feet feeling heavier than they had that morning, as if every step toward the exit was weighted with the choice she was about to make. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Tyler saw her. From somewhere in the graduating senior line, positioned alphabetically, a Brian near the front, her son turned his head at exactly the moment she stood. His face went from nervous excitement to confusion to something that looked like betrayal in the span of 3 seconds. He mouthed "Mom," but she was already moving, already walking toward the exit, already choosing to leave quietly rather than make a scene that would follow him across his graduation stage. The processional music began at exactly 10:01 a.m. Megan was at the gymnasium doors, her hand on the cold metal handle, when the first freshman volunteer usher collapsed. Sarah Chen, 14 years old, daughter of Mrs. Chen, dropped like gravity had decided to take her mid-stride. She fell into the aisle between the graduating seniors, her body rigid, her limbs seizing with the kind of violence that comes from complete neurological disruption. Her lips turned blue. Her chest moved asymmetrically, one side rising, one side failing. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung filling with air under pressure. Fatal if untreated within minutes. 200 parents gasped. Faculty members moved in conflicting directions, shouting contradictory orders. Sterling yelled for someone to call 911, to move her outside, his voice high and useless. No one was trained. No one knew what to do. And Megan was at the exit, her hand still on the door, about to walk away. The tremor in her right hand intensified. Not fear. Reflex. Muscle memory recognizing a crisis before her conscious mind could catch up. A flash of Sanjin, a child's face, dust-covered, the same blue lips, the same asymmetrical chest, the same seconds counting down. She closed her eyes. Made the choice. Megan pushed past the security guard with sudden authority, moving through the crowd with a precision that cut through chaos like a blade through silk. Her feet changed their rhythm. Her shoulders dropped. Her entire posture shifted from nurse to senior chief petty officer O'Brien in the span of crossing the gymnasium floor. She reached Sarah, knelt, her voice cutting through the panic. Everyone stepped back. Now. Not a request. It was a command, delivered with the force of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Heads turned. Parents froze. Even Dr. Sterling stopped mid-sentence. Her hands moved with 20 years of muscle memory, checking airway patency, assessing chest rise, identifying the absence of breath sounds on the left side. Tension pneumothorax. The girl had maybe 3 minutes before cardiac arrest. I need a pen, Megan called out, her voice steady, clinical. A ballpoint pen. Now. A teacher in the front row dropped one, the plastic clattering across the gymnasium floor. Megan reached it without looking, her right hand already at her waist, unbuckling her belt with the economy of motion that comes from practicing emergency procedures in the dust. 200 people watched as she positioned the pen, as she prepared the makeshift needle, as she made the choice that would prove this nurse was far more than anyone in that gymnasium had ever suspected. The silence was so thick you could have performed surgery in it. The processional march had reached its crescendo. Pomp and circumstance swelled through the gymnasium as 217 graduating seniors moved down the center aisle in their navy caps and gowns, their families rising to their feet. Tyler O'Brien walked in the middle section, 4th row, searching the bleachers for his mother's face and finding only empty space where she had been standing an hour ago. The morning sun cut through the high windows at exactly the angle that made the polished floor glow like a surgical suite. Everything was perfect. Everything was controlled. Everything was about to change. Megan had made it to the gymnasium exit, hand on the push bar, when she heard it. Not a sound. An absence of sound. The music stuttered. A girl screamed. Then the grinding collision of a teenage body hitting the hardwood floor with the kind of impact that travels through bone. Sarah Chen, a freshman in the honors program, had walked out to watch her older sister graduate. She had been standing in the 3rd row of the bleachers when her lungs forgot how to work. Tension pneumothorax doesn't announce itself politely. It collapses one lung, then builds pressure against the other, then presses against the heart like a fist closing. Sarah's eyes had widened. Her mouth had opened. Then her legs had buckled and she had fallen, convulsing, the rigid seizures of a body being starved of oxygen. Her sister screamed her name. The faculty froze. Principal Sterling stood motionless on the podium, staring. The athletic director reached for his phone but didn't dial. The school nurse, a woman named Patricia who had called in sick that morning, the position unfilled for 3 months, didn't exist. One of the administrators, a man in his 60s, moved toward the girl, then stopped, unsure. 200 parents watched their phones out, recording, their screens filling with footage of a child turning blue and nobody moving. Megan heard the sound of her daughter convulsing and her training took the wheel. Her boots hit the floor 3 times before the security guards even registered movement. Move. That was all she said. Not a request. A command. The older guard stepped aside automatically. Something in the tone had written a rank he couldn't see. The younger one grabbed her arm and she turned to look at him. Just looked. His hand released her bicep as if he'd touched a hot stove. She dropped to one knee beside Sarah. The girl's skin had gone the color of old concrete. Her lips had started to blacken at the edges. Oxygen saturation, Megan knew without instruments, had probably dropped below 60. Time was measured in heartbeats now, not seconds. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, Megan said aloud, her voice dropping 3 octaves, the tone of someone who had done this in Sanjin when helicopter rotor wash shook the tent. Her hands were already moving. She located the space between Sarah's ribs, 2 fingers up from the second rib, straight down the middle of the collarbone. There was a pen in the nearby superintendent's jacket pocket. She didn't ask. She took it. The pen barrel was plastic, hollow, approximately the diameter of a 14-gauge needle. Close enough. Better than close enough. Hold her steady, Megan said, and without question, 2 parents moved in and cradled the girl's shoulders. Megan positioned the pen point against Sarah's skin, felt the slight resistance of the muscular wall beneath, and pushed. Precisely. Steadily. The kind of push that comes from knowing exactly how much pressure bone and tissue require before they give. The pop came at exactly the depth she expected. Then the sound that meant she was right. The hiss. A sound like air escaping from a tire, but quieter, sharper, the hiss of a collapsed lung reinflating, of pressure equalizing, of a body getting a second chance. Sarah gasped. Her back arched upward, her seizures stilling. Her eyes flickered. The blue was receding from her lips. Oxygen was flowing again. Her lungs had remembered their job. Megan's belt came off in one motion and she used it to stabilize the makeshift catheter, keeping the pen barrel from shifting, holding pressure with the flat of her palm. Colors coming back, someone whispered. Is she breathing? Another voice. She's breathing. Sarah's chest rose and fell. Rose and fell. The girl's eyes opened, confused and gasping, but open. Alive. For minutes later, the paramedics arrived. They took one look at the setup, the pen barrel in the right position, the stabilization, the girl's steady vitals, her oxygen saturation climbing toward normal, and the lead paramedic, a man with 20 years of transport experience, knelt beside them. He said quietly, "Are you medical?" Megan didn't answer. Her hands had started to shake now that the crisis had passed, the adrenaline having nowhere to go but into tremor. The kind of tremor that comes from survival instinct finally recognizing that the danger was over. She pulled her hands back slowly and let the paramedics take over the patient transfer. They moved Sarah to the stretcher with practiced efficiency, already calling it into the ER. Sarah was stable. Sarah was alive. Sarah was going to be fine. 200 parents stood in absolute silence. The gymnasium had become a cathedral. Their phones still recorded. Their screens captured every moment. Tyler pushed through the crowd, searching for his mother. Mom? Mom, what? But Principal Sterling's face had gone white. Not the white of shock. Not the white of gratitude. The white of fury. She had drawn attention he could not control. She had demonstrated competence that exposed his incompetence. She had violated his direct order to leave his gymnasium, and worse, 200 witnesses had just watched her save a child's life with nothing but a pen and 30 seconds of surgical precision. The story was already being filmed. Already being shared. Already escaping from his grip. He turned on his heel and walked directly to his office. The door closed behind him with a kind of click that carried finality. The next hour happened in calculated silence. Principal Sterling sat at his desk, a mahogany monster that had cost the district $8,000 and that he'd requisitioned through his brother-in-law's consulting firm, and made 3 phone calls. His hands were steady. His voice was quiet. His strategy was perfect. Call 1, Jeff, It's Sterling. Yeah. I need you to flag a volunteer application for me. Incomplete background verification. Maybe run a full check. Could be liability. I know she saved the girl. That's not the point. The point is protocol. We need to cover ourselves. Thanks. Hughes hung up, already thinking about how to phrase it to the other board members. Call 2, Walsh? It's Sterling from Oak Creek. Listen, we had an incident at graduation today. Female volunteer performed an emergency medical procedure without authorization. I know, she saved a student. That's actually the problem. No oversight. No credentials verification. No documentation. We could be looking at a lawsuit if we don't move fast. Yes, I already have her name in the system. Just flag it. Call 3 came from a blocked number, a tip line, his voice altered by a hand over the phone. You might want to look into an incident at Jefferson High School in Denver today. Graduation ceremony. Unlicensed medical procedure performed during the processional. The details are: by evening, Megan was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her when the unmarked police sedan pulled into her driveway. 2 detectives with tired faces and a warrant for voluntary questioning. Tyler watched from the living room window, confused and frightened, as his mother went with them willingly. She didn't ask for a lawyer. She didn't protest. She simply stood, grabbed her jacket, and walked toward the door. Tell your father I'll call from the station, she said quietly. Mom, what's happening? But she was already gone. The police car pulled away, and Tyler stood alone in the house with nothing but the news broadcast on the television, footage of his mother performing the procedure repeating on every channel, and a single question forming in his mind: who was his mother, really? The phone rang at 3:08 p.m. Megan was still in her kitchen when the first officer arrived, badge catching the afternoon light that filtered through the lace curtains. There was no rage in his voice, no accusations, just questions, methodical and precise, the way someone documents evidence. Officer Chen sat across from her at the table where she'd eaten breakfast 20 hours earlier, Tyler upstairs in his room, listening to every word through the floor grate above the kitchen. She could hear his footsteps pacing, back and forth, back and forth. Walk me through what happened, Officer Chen said, pen poised. His partner, Officer Valdez, stood by the window, not threatening, just present. Megan's hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee. The ceramic was smooth against her palms, anchoring her to this moment when everything she'd built was collapsing like a structure engineered for exactly this kind of pressure. A student collapsed, Megan said quietly. Her voice was controlled, each word measured like medication dosage. Tension pneumothorax. The gymnasium was full of people. No one was moving. And you assessed this how? Chen's pen moved across the pad. Unconscious state. Cyanosis. Unilateral breath sounds absent on the right side. She paused. No pulse. No blood pressure. But you're not a physician. No. You're not even a licensed nurse in Colorado. The words hung there like a scalpel suspended above skin. Megan's jaw tightened, a small movement, barely perceptible, but the tremor that wanted to follow stayed locked inside her chest where it belonged. In the old days, before the civilian life, before the scrubs and the silence, tremors were a luxury she couldn't afford. They still weren't. I performed a needle decompression, she said. Using a ballpoint pen and a belt. Officer Valdez's eyebrows rose slightly. Officer Chen wrote the words down, then looked up. His expression had shifted, not disbelief, but a kind of grudging recognition that moved through his face like understanding dawning. You saved that girl's life. It wasn't a question. She would have died without it, Megan said. 200 people standing there. Hospital 6 minutes away. She didn't have 6 minutes. Chen nodded slowly, then returned to his questions. The interrogation lasted 2 hours. Not aggressive, they asked about her medical background, her training, her credentials, why she hadn't called 911 first, whether she'd done this kind of intervention before. Each question was a door opening, and Megan carefully closed each one behind her, giving them medical facts and nothing else. No mention of 20 years in uniform. No mention of the field medicine courses, the trauma protocols, the 3 times she'd performed needle decompression in a combat zone with the sound of gunfire like a second heartbeat. No mention of the names of the soldiers she'd saved who didn't make it home anyway. No mention of Danny Reeves, 8 years old, pulled from a collapsed building in San Jin while rounds struck the concrete around her. Upstairs, Tyler's pacing stopped. Silence was sometimes worse than sound. By 6:15 p.m., the police had what they needed. Officer Chen stood, clicked his pen, slid the notepad into his back pocket. "Mrs. O'Brien, we won't be pressing charges. But your volunteer badge is being confiscated pending investigation. You'll need to provide documentation of your medical qualifications and authorization to practice any kind of medicine or medical intervention in Colorado schools." "I understand," Megan said. They left quietly. The door closed with a soft click. Megan sat motionless at the kitchen table, listening to the house settle around her, listening to the sound of Tyler's door opening upstairs, then closing again. She heard his footsteps retreat to his room. She didn't follow. Not yet. An hour later, as the sun was bleeding orange across the Denver sky, a black sedan pulled into her driveway. Dr. Sterling emerged from the passenger side, moving with a kind of deliberate slowness that announces victory. He was dressed in pressed slacks and a charcoal polo shirt embroidered with the Oak Creek Memorial logo. His smile was the smile of a man who had made a phone call and watched dominoes fall exactly as he'd planned. Because that's what had happened: 3 calls to board members indebted to him, 1 call to the district office representative flagging her volunteer application for incomplete background verification, 1 anonymous tip to Channel 7 News about an unqualified volunteer practicing medicine without a license. He'd activated every mechanism in his institutional arsenal, and all of them had worked. He didn't bother knocking. Megan opened the door before his fist reached it, and Sterling's expression flickered a fraction of a second where she saw him recalculate, adjust his approach. Good. Let him feel the smallest edge of the soldier underneath the nurse. "Mrs. O'Brien." His voice was smooth as silicone. "This is a formal trespassing warning." He held out papers, the kind with official letterhead and legal language designed to cage people. "Effective immediately, you are barred from Oak Creek Memorial High School property. Your volunteer status is revoked. If you attempt to attend any school functions, including tomorrow's rescheduled graduation, you will be arrested for trespassing." Megan took the papers. Her hands didn't shake. But Sterling was watching for that, watching for the break he'd orchestrated, the moment she would crumble under the weight of public humiliation and institutional power. She'd already given him everything else. The only thing left was her composure, and that, she understood now, was the one thing he could never actually take. "I understand," she said. He turned to leave, shoulders square, the gait of a man who had just won a war against a woman who'd never been allowed to fight back. He paused at the car door, looking back at her one final time. "The truth is, Mrs. O'Brien, you were never going to fit in here. Some people don't belong in schools. Some people belong in the dark, where no one has to see them." He smiled, the kind of smile that belonged on a predator's face. "You're done here." The car pulled away. Megan stood in the doorway, the trespassing warning trembling in her hands, not from fear, but from the effort of containing something much larger and much more dangerous than fear. She had held this kind of pressure inside her body for 2 decades. She knew how much weight a person could carry before the structure began to fail. She knew the precise moment when careful restraint became something else entirely. She walked inside and closed the door. The kitchen was exactly as she'd left it. The table held the detritus of a life deliberately kept small, a half-empty coffee cup, a stack of volunteer coordination emails printed and neatly filed, a single photograph of Tyler from his 18th birthday, before graduation, before this. And on the table, where she'd placed them this morning without thinking, were her combat boots. The leather was scuffed and cracked, creased at the ankles from 20 years of walks she wasn't supposed to take anymore, missions she wasn't supposed to remember. She'd kept them in a box in her closet because throwing them away felt like forgetting, and forgetting felt like betrayal. Megan pulled out a chair and sat down. She picked up the boots, one in each hand, and looked at them the way a person looks at proof. Physical evidence of everything she'd buried. Everything she'd tried to leave behind. Everything that had just been ripped open in front of 200 people and their phones and their recordings and their questions she would never be able to answer without destroying the life she'd built for her son. Tyler found her like that at midnight, paralyzed in the kitchen chair, holding those boots like they might explain something, like they might justify what she'd done, like they might somehow make sense of the impossible choice between staying invisible and watching a girl die. "Mom." His voice came from the doorway, small and confused and terrified in a way she'd never heard before. "Why are you home? The graduation practice was tonight. You said you'd be there all evening. You said you didn't want to miss anything." Megan looked up at him. Her son, tall now, almost a man, nothing of the boy she'd carried through a decade of careful normalcy, was staring at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Like he'd just realized his entire mother was a stranger wearing her face. "Mom, what happened?" She opened her mouth. Closed it. The words wouldn't come because the words would require explanation. An explanation would require a version of herself she'd spent 20 years dismantling. She couldn't tell him. Couldn't explain the boots or the silence or the reason she sometimes woke up at 3 a.m. gasping, convinced she was back in a building that was falling and children were dying and her hands couldn't move fast enough to save them all. Instead, she just held the boots closer and felt something inside her finally fracture. Tyler stood frozen in the doorway, watching his mother, the strongest person he'd ever known, the woman who'd held their family together through every crisis, every uncertainty, every dark moment that had come before, shatter into pieces right in front of him. Her shoulders began to shake. Her breathing came in gasps, huge and uncontrolled, the kind of crying that only comes from holding too much inside for far too long. He'd never seen her cry. Not once in his entire life. He pulled out a chair and sat beside her, not touching her, just being there, just bearing witness to whatever this was, this fracture, this break in the person he'd built his entire world around. She held the boots and sobbed, 19 years of containment pouring out in gasps that sounded like drowning. Later, much later, when she'd cried herself hollow and the house had returned to silence, Tyler went upstairs to his room and sent a text message to a number he'd kept for years. A number his mother didn't know he had. A number for someone who'd been part of his childhood, someone who'd disappeared into the military and left bouquets on their porch every single year without fail. "Danny, something's wrong. Really wrong. She won't tell me what happened, but I think she needs help. I think something from before, something she never told me about, I think it just came back." He hit send and waited, staring at the screen, watching the 3 dots appear, watching his childhood best friend type a response that would, unknowingly, set into motion the events that would finally answer the question he'd been asking his entire life. Who was his mother, really? The next morning, the gymnasium doors opened to something Principal Sterling had not planned for. The morning sun streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the bleachers where 200 people had gathered, not for a rescheduled graduation, but for something far worse, from his perspective. Parents whispered. Board members exchanged glances. Sterling stood near the podium, still confident, still untouchable, unaware that the man walking through the doors in the back would unravel everything he'd constructed. Omodi moved with the deliberate pace of someone carrying a weight that transcended his frame. 20 years. That's how long he'd carried the memory of a young Navy officer pulling him from rubble in Sanjin, treating his wound without asking his name, without knowing he'd been on the other side of the conflict. She'd saved him that day without knowing it would reshape the entire trajectory of his life. He'd escaped, rebuilt himself as a translator, a refugee, a father. And then he'd walked into Oak Creek Memorial 2 days ago for his daughter Sarah's graduation ceremony, only to hear the name of the woman who'd treated a collapsed student during the processional. Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien. The voice had been the same. The hands had been the same. The composure under crisis had been unmistakable. He'd spent the last 48 hours making phone calls. Not to lawyers. Not to district administrators. To Danny Reeves, the Navy SEAL officer who'd sent Megan flowers every year since he was 8 years old. The young man who'd never forgotten the nurse in Denver who'd pulled him from a collapsed building in San Jin during his first deployment, before she'd left the military, before she'd chosen a quiet life as a civilian. "I need to speak," Omodi said, his accent carrying the weight of authenticity. His voice cut through the gymnasium like a blade finding its mark. Sterling's face shifted. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his features, the first genuine emotion anyone had witnessed from him in years. The gymnasium fell silent. The kind of silence where you hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, where you hear your own heartbeat. 20 years ago, in San Jin, a Navy officer saved my life. I was wounded. Bleeding. She treated me without hesitation, without judgment. I did not know her name then. I know it now. I know she is here. In Denver. Working as a nurse. Being treated like she is nobody. Omodi's voice rose, not in anger, but in clarity. I have asked the Navy SEAL team that respects her to come here today. To tell you who she is. To tell you what you have done. Sterling's jaw tightened. His hands moved to his sides, fingers curling slightly. The first sign of panic. The first crack in the facade. The gymnasium doors opened again. 6 men in Navy dress whites walked through in formation, their uniforms immaculate, their bearing radiating the kind of authority that cannot be challenged or questioned. They moved like a unit, like men who had trained together, bled together, survived together. The lead officer stepped forward, and everyone in the gymnasium recognized him. Danny Reeves. Tyler's childhood friend. The boy who'd left to become one of the most decorated operators in naval special warfare. He approached Megan, who sat in the third row between her son and Omodi's daughter Sarah. His uniform was crisp as fresh-cut paper. His eyes were clear. When he spoke, his voice carried the precision of military command, but underneath it was something deeper. Respect. Recognition. Honor. Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien, permission to speak, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a protocol. A formality that transformed a gymnasium into a courtroom of witness. Megan stood. Her composure was absolute. Her face betrayed nothing. But her hands that had trembled 48 hours ago, were steady. Danny reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, its edges worn, its classification markings visible even from the back rows. Megan's eyes widened. Just for a moment. Just a fraction of a second. But enough for anyone paying attention to understand that this moment was breaking something open inside her. He handed her the folder. Mission classified. 20 years of documentation. 20 years of operations she'd buried so deeply that even her own son didn't know they existed. The SEAL team leader stepped to the microphone. His name was Commander James Halifax, and his voice was the opposite of Sterling's. It carried no arrogance, only weight. He opened a second folder and began to read. Bronze Star with Valor for Medical Leadership during Operation Enduring Freedom, Kandahar Province, 2004. The gymnasium held its breath. Bronze Star with Valor for Field Trauma Intervention under Direct Fire, Helmand Province, 2006. Sterling's face had gone pale. Chalk white. The color of a man watching his kingdom collapse in real time. Navy Cross for Extraordinary Heroism and Devotion to Duty, San Jin Valley, 2007. 17 confirmed combat medical saves. 3 of those saves under direct enemy fire. Multiple confirmed engagements where Senior Chief O'Brien prioritized patient care over personal safety. The gymnasium erupted. Not in applause yet. In gasps. In the sound of 200 people recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the quiet nurse in combat boots. Sterling stepped backward. His hand reached for the podium to steady himself. His mouth opened but no words came. The confident administrator who'd humiliated Megan in staff lounges, who'd knocked coffee from her hands with dismissive cruelty, who'd bet $50 she'd quit within a week, that man was gone. What remained was hollow. Exposed. Terrified. The gymnasium doors opened one final time. An FBI agent in a dark suit walked down the center aisle with the kind of purposeful stride that silenced even the whispers. Behind him were two more agents. They were not there for Megan. Principal Robert Sterling, the lead agent, said, his voice flat, official, final. You are under arrest for embezzlement, wire fraud, and misappropriation of school district funds. You have the right to remain silent. The applause started then. Not polite. Not restrained. The gymnasium erupted like a pressure valve releasing. Parents stood. Students stood. The sound echoed off the rafters and crashed down like thunder. Sterling reached for his briefcase. One of the security guards, the same guard who'd escorted Megan from the building 48 hours ago, stepped forward. He held out a cardboard box, the kind used for removing personal items from an office. His expression was neutral, but his eyes held something that looked like shame. I believe you know the way out, sir, the guard said. Sterling took the box. His hands were shaking now. He walked toward the exit, escorted by two agents, while the gymnasium watched in collective silence. Somewhere in that silence was vindication. Somewhere in that silence was justice. But mostly there was the sound of institutional corruption collapsing under the weight of truth. Megan stood motionless, the classified folder still in her hands. Danny Reeves approached and asked silently, just a nod, a question in his eyes, if he could embrace his former senior chief. She nodded once. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, and for the first time in front of 200 witnesses, Megan O'Brien allowed herself to be held. His 5 teammates stood at attention behind him, a wall of respect made of bone and discipline. Tyler was suddenly beside her too, his arms around her shoulders, his voice breaking. Why didn't you tell me? Megan's voice, when she spoke, was barely audible. Because I wanted to be just your mom. Not a hero. Not a veteran. Just yours. The rescheduled graduation proceeded with Megan seated in the front row. 6 Navy SEALs stood on a guard along the gymnasium walls. When they called Tyler O'Brien's name, when he walked across the stage to receive his diploma from the district superintendent instead of Sterling, the entire senior class stood in spontaneous ovation. Not for Tyler. For his mother. If you've been with us before, welcome back, hit that like button. If you're new, we're glad you're here, please subscribe. Either way, leave a comment and say hello.